Hey guys, welcome back to our JavaScript series. In this video, we're going to talk about functions in JavaScript. Now, functions in JavaScript basically help you to write a block of code and then you can run that block of code whenever you want at any place in your code. So you just have to write that block of code once and you can run it in any place in your code file, right? That's what functions help you to do. Now, just so that's very clear, as we have already studied about conditional iterative statement, conditional statements helps to actually go and run a block of code only when a condition is satisfied, correct? Iterative statements help you to run a code multiple times in a loop, right? And then now we're talking about functions, which basically help you to write a block of code, which you can then run at any place in your code. Okay. Now you might ask what's the importance of that. So I'm just gonna give you one example for that. Let's actually go to iterative statements and copy for loop from here. Okay. So I'm just gonna copy this for loop. Now let's say what I want to do here is that I want to run this this code for like printing up to n, that is 40. I want to run this code like at 4 places in my code. Okay. First of all, I want to run it at the start. Then what I want to do, then I want to like, do some console log, ran first time. Then what I do, then I again want to run this code, right? So I just, copy this. Let's make it N1. Or let's do one thing. Let's go and create a block inside it so that it basically doesn't conflict with the N over here, right? Now you can see it's not conflicting. And I just say ran second time, right? And then I want to run this the third time and then say ran third and last time, right? So as you can see what I did, I had a block of code over here and I wanted to run this block of code at multiple places. I will first of all want to run this at the start. Then after this console log, I again wanted to run this. Then after this console log, I wanted to again run this, right? Then after this console log, I want to run this again. That's where functions are helpful. What you can do, instead of copying this code again and again, you can create a function from this block. Once you have created the function from this block, you basically give a name to a function, by the way. So once you have created the function, then you go and call it here, here, and also obviously here. You have to call it, then only the function would run, right? So that's the advantage of function. You don't need to copy this code and again at different places. If you're using if you're doing that without a function, you would have to do copying stuff just like I'm doing here, right? I have to copy it multiple times at different places so that I can run it at different places, right? And that's where functions basically help. Now, just to show how function would help over here, I would like to talk about function declaration, which would also explain how you can create a function, right? So this is without function. And after studying about function declaration, we can talk about with functions, right? So let's talk about function declaration. What is function declaration? So just like we declare a variable, right? Let or var, that's how we declare a variable, right? There, and for constants, we use const. That basically helps us to declare constant. Just like that, function is a keyword that helps you to declare a function. So you already know that you can do something like this, right? N equal to 40, and that basically declares a constant. In the same way, to declare a function, what you need to do is, let me show you, declare a function. For this, what you need to do is that you need to use the function keyword. So what you can do is here, you can just say function. Then you need to give a name to the function. So let's say this function here, let's try to think of a name for it. So maybe like print print number up to n, right? And then we give this parenthesis and then we give the curly braces. So what you can see over here is that we have created a function, print up number up to n. That's the name of the function. And basically this is the block of the code that we executed whenever we want to run this function. Okay. So you just go and copy this code over here inside this, and then basically that would run the function that would basically create the function. So now this function has been created. Now if you go actually and if you open Poker.js file, now first of all, if you copy the code from here, you would see that it just runs the code directly, right? Because it was a block and there was no condition or something like that attached to it. So it just ran directly and you got the outputs everywhere you ran it. But when you talk about this code, don't expect this to run immediately. If I copy this over here, you would see that it's not running immediately. I'm not seeing anything over here. I've just created the function, right? Now, what I have to do is I have to call this function. Call means you are running a function. So how you can call a function? Call a function is very easy. You just say print number up to n. This is the name of the function. You need to say that. And then after that, you have to give parentheses. That would call the function and basically and then the function would run. Okay, so you can see over here when I call the function got run. So it printed up to 40, correct? In the same way, I can go and run this multiple times. So you can see over here, I just ran it 4 times, it would run 4 times. And hopefully I see the output accordingly. So you can see over here, uh, it's up to 40 the first time, then again from 1 to 40 the second time, right? And then from 1 to 40 again the third time. Like that, it's also there fourth time. So like that, you can see it basically runs accordingly. And obviously if I try to, like, put some kind of statement before the second run, that would be printed before this gets executed. So if you see the output, would be like 1 to 40 hello, and then 1 to 40. Let me show you the output over here. So you can see that it's basically like this: 1 to 40, right? After that 40 is finished, it prints hello, and then it again 1 to 40. So I hope that makes sense, because like you first of all printed 1 to 40, then you printed hello, and then you printed 1 to 40 again. So you can see that's how easy it is to create a function and then call that function. Okay, so that's how you can declare a function. Let me go and take this here. But yeah, that's how you can declare a function. Now, if you see the advantage over here, you have already seen it, I hope. It's very easy, right? If I go here and copy this and I show you this with functions, so what I can do, I can just go and create a function out of it, right? So let me actually go and copy the function declaration that I already created for this. I'm just going to copy that here. And then what I do, I just go and say print number up to n times. Okay, and then I just go and console log that ran the first time, then I print the number again, right? um, and then I say console log ran second time, then I just did it again, and I said console log the third time, right? So that's how you can see I'm basically running this at multiple places. Now, obviously, this is not the best example to actually show the use case for the functions. You might learn about it as you actually code and use functions. Right now, the main point that I wanted to communicate is that basically functions help you to run the block of code at different places without copying the block of code over there. And by the way, as you can see over here, I'm able to run this block of code multiple times, but it's still different from the loops, because loops are just made for that purpose. You can't run the code of a loop uh, at multiple places, right? That's not possible. Okay, if you write a loop, it would first complete that loop and then only move forward. Here you can basically create a function, call that function, write some other code, and then call that function again, which is not possible with loops. So that's something I want to differentiate over there, so that's very clear to you, right? Anyways, that's about function declaration. That's how you can declare a function. Next thing is parameters and arguments for a function. Now, what is parameter and argument? So it's a very important thing to understand. Like for example, in this case, if you see, I had a function, this one, right? Now let's say what I want to do here, I want to actually go and customize the value of n. Right now, the value of n is fixed. In a way, the function can be called 40 times, right? Up to 40 actually, yeah. This can be easily called like this because n is fixed over here. But what if you want to make the function accept the value of n and then accordingly run the loop? Is that possible? The answer is yes. How you can do that? The way to do that is parameters and arguments. So basically, a function can accept some parameters, right? And accordingly, it can take some action. So in this case, if you talk about this basically is run prints up to 40 always. No matter how many times you call it, it would just print up to 40, right? But what I can do here is that I can just go and make a customizable function, right? Prints according to n passed to it. So what I can do here, how I can do that is basically using parameters and arguments as I said. So what I do here is that I just go and I remove this n and I basically write over here n. Now, when I do that, it this function would now start accepting a value of n. Okay, so that n would be used over here then. So what I can do, I can just call this function, but I have to pass the value of n to it. Let me actually take this to Coca.js just so that's very clear. So now if I go and first of all call this function, then it will just print up to 40. That's fixed, right? It won't change that. Print number up to n, that's calling this. Actually, it would call this, so it's causing some issues because of that. Let me actually go and say this is 40. Okay, now I'm just calling the 40 function. Yeah, so you can see when I do that, you can see that basically goes and prints up to 40 as we expected. Correct. Now let's do one thing. Let's go and call this function. So as I said, when you're calling this function, you need to pass the value of n to it because this function doesn't have a value of n fixed inside it, just like we had in this function. So what I can do, I can just go and call this function, and here you pass the value of n. So in this case, I want to pass the value of, let's say, 4. When I do that, you can see it just prints up to 4. Why? Because this n over here would get a value of 4. Let me actually console log n so that you can see that, and you can see it gets a value of 4, which is what we understood from here, right? Let's go and run this again. This time I can pass 8 to it, and you can see it basically got a value of 8 over here in the second call, and it also like printed up to 8. So that's how you can use this function parameters and arguments. And by the way, just to differentiate between parameters and arguments, so basically this is parameter, okay, and this is argument, okay. So when you're creating a function and you're defining these things that are parameters, and when you're calling the function passing the values of those values are basically called arguments. That's how you can differentiate between these two things. Okay, so yeah, that's how basically you can do it. Let's talk about some other things here. And by the way, one more thing here is that you're not required to pass this value. Like if I don't pass this value, it's not going to cause any issues. Like it's just gonna make n undefined. So if I go and call this again, and this time I don't pass it some values, so I just do this. You can see what I get the value of n is undefined, right? Which means the value of n is not passed, so it's not defined. That's how it is. It's not gonna raise any kind of error, okay? But you should be careful about it. It depends on the function, right? You should be very, very careful about it. Like in this case, you should obviously pass the value of n so that it actually does some kind of stuff, right? And so that's the thing. But basically, if you don't pass any argument, then it will just go and make it undefined. Okay. Anyways, let's talk about the next thing. So you saw this parameter and arguments here. We just had one parameter accepted by the function. Now what we're gonna do is that we're gonna accept multiple parameters, right? So how you can do that? That's very easy again. It's not a very big thing here. Let me actually go to the I think the strings lecture would be the one I would like to go there. Um, Literal, and yeah, I would like to take this example over here. Yeah, this one's better. So what I want to go and create a function. Let's say we call it as introduce me, right? So what this function does is that it will introduce you, right? So it would console log the introduction. So let's say I'm just gonna paste this over here. Okay. Now when you call this function, it will just introduce you. Now right now, if we call this directly, it would basically cause error. So you can see name is not defined because like I have not defined the variable name and age. So what I can do, I can just define it over here. Obviously, I can just do something like this. In that case, you can see it just works fine, and it introduces me properly. But the thing is that I want to make this function general purpose. What that means is that I want to make this function in a way that it accepts the name and the age, and accordingly it prints the introduction. So this function can be used by anyone who wants to introduce themselves, right? It's just not about my name and my age. Anyone can do that. So how I can do thing like this? That it's very easy. What you have to do here is that you have to give the parameters. So just like in this case, I gave a parameter n. This time I'm gonna give two parameters. So I'm gonna give one parameter name. For second parameter, I need to first of all give a comma that would separate the second parameter, and then you need to give the second parameter, which is age. So you can see when I did that, right now I'm not getting any kind of error, but still you can see one thing over here, and that is I'm getting my name is undefined and my age is undefined, which makes a lot of sense because in this case, name and age both will be undefined, right? So I need to pass like a proper age and name. So I'm just gonna pass that. So introduce me Tushar 20. And when I do that, you can see I get my introduction here. My name is Tushar and my age is 20. So that's why you can see I can create a function with different number of parameters. It's not about just having one parameter. You can have n number of parameters, doesn't matter, right? So I hope that makes sense. That's how you can use parameters and arguments. Now, sometimes what happens is that you want the function to accept some parameters, but at the same time, you want it to actually get a default value. You want the function to get the default value of parameters in case I don't pass the value of those parameters. So let me give you an example here. Let's say I want to go and take this function. Okay. So let's say I want to actually go and like if I go and run this here without any value of n, it just gets undefined, which means it won't run at all. I want to do something else here. I want to make it in a way that if the n value is not passed, then it automatically gets a value of 10. Okay. So right now, if I pass like 20 here, then it will just go and print the value up to 20, right? Let's modify this to basically allow it to get a value of 10 if I don't pass the value of n. So I'm just gonna name it as, let's say, with default. So what I have to do over here, it's very easy. I need to give a default value to a parameter. So how I can do that is I just need to say n. After that, I just give an equals to sign and I say 10 over here, right? Now when I say this, uh, basically if I don't pass any kind of value to this function, it would get the values up to 10. Let me show you. If I do this, you can see it's getting up to 10. Like I didn't pass anything, but it still got a value of 10 inside the n. And then it just ran the loop up to 10. But if I pass it some kind of value, then it would stick to that value instead. So you can see it's helpful in both cases. You can give a custom value, or you can just have it will just use the default value. So I hope that makes a lot of sense. That's how you can basically go and uh, uh, give a default value to the function parameters. And the same you can do with other function parameters as well. That's possible. So for example, here, let's take the example of that introduction function. So if let's say, actually create our own function, let's do that. So let's say add three numbers. Okay. I'm creating this function that adds three numbers, A, B, and C. Okay. And it basically prints the value of that addition. So A plus B plus C. Okay. So if I call this directly, you would see that would just go and like, if I pass the values, you can see it prints 6, right? Which is good. Now let's say I want to give a default value here. So let's say I want to give default values to all three of them. What I can do in that case is that I can just go on. First of all, let me just say one here. So that's differentiate with this one. Okay. I can just give it a value, default value. So A equal to 10, B equal to 20, C equal to 30. Now in this case, if I call this add three numbers and I don't pass any value, then it would print not a number. Now why that is happening? That is happening because A, B, and C would all get a value of undefined. Now, I don't know if you know about it, but I actually talked about it in the type conversion lecture already. That undefined basically gets converted to not a number. In this case, undefined had to convert to a number because you're using an arithmetic operator, so it has to be converted to not a number, right? And uh, so basically, if you add all these three not a numbers, then it would give you not a number, which makes a lot of sense, right? And that's why you're getting a lot of numbers. So again, I just expect you to have a very good understanding of type conversion. If you don't have watched this lecture, it has a lot of things about it, and otherwise you won't be able to understand all these things. So you can see here clearly that undefined basically means not a number, and that's why you're getting a not a number as an output, right? Anyways, you can see how it's working. Let's go and call this function here. Now, if I call this function with all the values that it needs, then this is gonna go and say, let's say 1, 2, 3. Okay, so you can see it prints 6 over here, which is all good. But if I don't provide it any value, then it's just gonna print 60, which is the sum of all these things over here, right? Which is again good. And again, I can just go and like also provide values to, for example, a. So what I want to do is that I want to provide the value of A, but skip the other ones. So what I can do over here is that I can just say 20 over here, and the others are skipped, right? So now you're just providing the value for A, and B and C are not provided any kind of values, right? So yeah, that's how you can do it. And then let's say you want to go and provide a value to B, but you don't want to provide a value to A, and you don't want to provide a value of C, then what you can do? Now, in this case, you might assume that I have to go and say comma 40 comma. That's what you might expect. But the thing is that it's not gonna happen like that. If you try to do something like this, it's not gonna work. So why it doesn't work? The reason is very simple. When you're doing something like this, it doesn't mean you are skipping these parameters. It's a syntax error. To solve this, what you have to do over here is that you have to go and basically give a value of undefined to those parameters, which then basically means that you're not providing it any kind of value. So when you passed undefined for these two were defaulted to 10 and 30, and then 10 and 30 got added, which became 40, and then you pass 40 for B, so 40 plus 40 gave you 80, right? So that's how you can see it's working. Let me just print it anyways, A, B, C. So you can see over here, that's what it happened, right? A and C got a default value. So I hope you understood. If you want to like give a default value to, let's say, the first one, but not to the second one, then you can do something like this. Same goes over here. If you want to give second and third a value, and first you want to have a default value, then you can just go and pass it over here. That you pass the value of B and C and passed undefined for A. And you can see in that case, you got 100 because 40 plus 15, 90, and then A got a default value of 10, which made it 100, right? So I hope that's clear. Now that also shows you one thing. Um, if you remember, I actually talked about undefined versus null, right? Now, as I already shown you in ECMAScript specification clearly states that undefined means that the value is not defined, whereas null means intentional absence of a value. That's what you understood about undefined and null, right? So we talked about this already, and I'm just going to give you proof of that. The proof is default arguments, default parameters, basically. So here you can see that if I go and pass undefined, as you already have seen, that if I pass undefined, that means the A would get a default value. Now the question comes, if I pass null instead of undefined, what would happen in that case? So let me show you that, just so that's very clear. What would happen in this case, I'm just going to show you. So if I remove undefined from here, or actually let's take this one, let's just play with one, or actually let's keep both of them. Let's play with both of them actually. So that would be better. So now what if I go and make this null? So when you do that, if you check the values over here, then you would see that the first argument gets a value of null. It didn't got a default value. All right. That proves that undefined actually means not defined. Null doesn't mean not defined. And here, default values would only be given when you have not defined the value. Like in this case, you didn't define any value over here, right? You just directly call the function, and that's why there was no defined value. In this case, also you didn't give any given any value, and that's why every value became undefined. And that's why the default value was assigned. But if you don't do something like this and you pass null there, then you cannot expect the parameter to receive a default value, because JavaScript doesn't consider null as not defined. JavaScript considers null as intentional absence of value. And so in this case, you get null 40 and 30. Null for A, 40, B was overridden, and C was passed as undefined, so it got a default value. You Now you add these things. When you add these things, you would get a 70, because null basically means 0. So when it's converted to a number, it would become 0. If you check this, you can see you're getting 70, which makes a lot of sense, right? The same goes over here. If you try to do this, then you would get 90. Check this, you get 90 over here, right? And you basically receive null here. Okay, so I hope that's clear, and that basically also clears that null was an undefined valid thing that I told you earlier. But anyways, that's how you can do it. And by the way, I can just also go and pass like two parameters here and skip the third one, which is all fine. So I can do something like this, and you can see that basically gives me uh this over here, 20, 40, and 30. All of that get added, and I basically get a value of 90 over here. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So yeah, that's how you can basically go and use default values, and I hope you understood the difference between null and undefined, and this fact that you can't basically go and use that interchangeably. It's not possible. Anyways, let's paste this to the file itself, and let's move forward. Um, Next thing we can talk about is returning a value from a function. Now, again, it's a very, very interesting thing to talk about. Now let's say I want to copy, let me see, actually, we just talked about that parameters and arguments. Yeah, this one here. Let's say I want to copy this here. Okay. Now what I want to do in this case, so you can see right now, if I call introduce me, let me call this, if I pass Tushar and 20, you can see it basically prints the introduction. But in some cases, just printing or doing any kind of other stuff will not help. In some cases, what you want to do is that you want to get the value, the result of the function, right? In that case, you can also go and return the value from a function. Okay. So in this case, for example, I want to get the value of this function. Basically, I want to get this value as a return value. I don't want the function to print the value itself. I want to return the value to me, and then I would see what I have to do with that value. Okay. I can print it, I can throw it away, whatever I want to do, I can do it. I just want the function to return that value to me rather than printing that on its own. Okay. So again, I'm not saying that you have to always return a value. Sometimes just printing that value directly might be helpful for you, then you just do that. Okay. It just depends on the use case. In this case, I want to get the value back for the introduction. So what I can do, I can just go and return that value. So to return that value, you need to use a keyword in JavaScript called return. So you say return, and then you specify the value you want to return. Now that value can be anything. You can return a number, you can return a big int, you can return anything here. Okay. In this case, I'm going to return a string. So I'm just going to return this whole string over here. Now, you can see when I am returning this, I'm not getting any kind of logs in the console, which makes a lot of sense because I got the value back and function didn't print the value. Now, what that means is that this function is actually returning me a value. If you actually hover over this, you can already see that it returns me the value of string, which is basically this string. So what I can do, I can capture this value inside a constant or variable, or I can directly console log this value, or whatever I want to do, I can do that with that value. So first I'm just going to show you how I can console log that. So I can just say console log, and then I basically write the function over here, and that would basically go and uh, print the value that is returned from this function. Another thing is that I can capture that. So introduction for Tushar, I can capture that inside this constant, and then I can print that value of constant here, and that would just work fine, right? Or let's say this function didn't return any kind of full stop at the end. So I just want to, create a function called add full stop, and that basically accepts a string and returns a string uh, with the full stop, something like this. So what I can do in that case is that I can just go and again like pass this value to another function. So I can do something like this, add full stop, and then I basically go and say introduction for Tushar. That's one thing I can do, or I can just go and say introduce me, and then I just say name and age. So I hope you can see what I'm doing over here. Just to make it more clear, I'm just going to format it properly. I hope, let's see, I'm just going to format it directly because Prettier doesn't think that it's worth it to format it right now. But sometimes, Prettier would format it if it's too nested. In this case, it was not that nested, but yeah, it just depends, right? Anyways, I'm just gonna do it on my own. So you can see what I'm doing over here. If it's still not clear, now it would be clear. What I do first is that I just call introduce me, that returns a value that is then passed to add full stop function. Okay. So in this case, my introduction, that is this one, is passed to add full stop. And then after that, add full stop basically returns that same string with a full stop at the end, which is then passed to console log function. And by the way, this is one interesting thing here, right? Console log is also a function. And that's very interesting thing to know, because you were calling console log from so long and you didn't even know about that console log is a function, right? But now you know about it because we have talked about functions here. You can see it's basically a function that you're calling like this, and you pass it a value. So that and the console log just prints that value into the screen. Now how it does that, it's just all implementation details. We don't need to discuss about that. But anyways, I hope you got the idea. The value returned from add full stop is then passed to console log, which then prints that value, and then we get the output from there. I hope that makes a lot of sense, and that's how you can like even go and nest the functions here, like basically call the functions in a nested way. But the thing that I wanted to tell about from this thing is that you can go and return a value of return a value from the function, and you can use that value anywhere you want to use it. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And one last thing over here is that what would happen if a function doesn't return a value? Okay, so let's say if I say introduce me without return, in that case, if I just go and console log it directly, okay, so console log, I directly uh, print that value. In that case, what would be the return value here? Like what this function returns then. Now, I hope you understand about null and undefined already. So if you understand about it properly, I hope you know the answer. The answer is that this would return undefined because you are not returning anything. That means it's undefined. Okay. So if you check this, you can see it's basically like if you check the hover, if you hover over there, you can see void, which basically means nothing. And if you actually try to print this, you would see that it returns undefined. Okay. So yeah, that's the thing. If you don't add a return, it would implicitly return undefined. Okay. But you can do one more thing here. One last thing I'm just going to show you here. Let's say add two numbers. Okay. And I just go and do something like this. And I add the number, then I return the value. Now, if I go and say add two numbers, get the value 2 and 3 and get the sum of that and print the value here, you can see the value here. Now, let's say I want to go and make a second variant of it. Um, so let's say this variant would basically print the value and don't return anything. So you can see if I go and print the value here, basically I pass the values here, then it would just go and print those values, print the sum of those values, and won't return anything. So if it's not returning anything, we already understood it's going to return you undefined, which is what we get over here. But I can also go and explicitly return undefined over here. So what I can do, I can just go and say console log a plus b, and then I go and say return undefined, and I just call it that. So you can see that also basically returns you undefined. Okay. And then another variant for this is this. So if I go and say 4 here, and then what I do, I just go and say a plus b, and then I just remove even the value that I'm returning. In this case also, you would get a value of undefined, okay? Because when you are returning something, but you're not telling the value that you're returning, that means that you are returning undefined, okay? Now, one last thing over here is that what would happen if you try to write a code after return? Now, if you try to write a code after return, that code would never get executed. Let me show you. So let's say if I take this function and I say add three numbers, let's say add three numbers, and I take A, B, and C, and then I return the value of A plus B plus C. Now, if I try to call this function and pass the values here, then it would just go and return me uh, 6 in this case, which makes sense. But let's say if I try to add something after this, then what would happen? So first of all, if I add something before return, then in that case, that code would basically run. But if I try to add something after return, that code would never run. So you can see over here, this code never runs. Okay. So it's basically like break in loops. If you say return at any point in the code block of the function, it would stop executing the function from there and would just return back the value that you set to it. Okay. Otherwise, if you don't give any return statement like we did in, for example, this example, then it just goes and returns nothing or returns undefined implicitly. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. And that's how you can just return a value from a function. Let me just go and paste it over here. Okay, now let's talk about function expression. So function expression is basically an alternative syntax you can use for creating a function. Basically, when using function declaration, you declare a function, right? And when you're creating a function as function expression, then you are creating a function as a value, and then storing that value inside a variable or constant. Now, I know this might sound confusing at first, but I'm just going to explain that in detail in a bit. And we're also going to talk about the difference between function declaration and function expression. Basically, the practical differences you would see when using either of them. Okay. So let's get started with that, and let's talk about this. So I just want to take two examples for that. Maybe I can go to the parameters and arguments. I think there were two examples that were good here. So I'm just going to copy this one, and I'm just going to copy, let's say this one. Okay. So these are two examples I'm going to use to actually explain this stuff. Um, so yeah, and one more thing, by the way, before we continue, just want to clear it out that you can use any of these syntaxes like function declaration or function expression. Everything that I told you till now, default values for function parameter agreement, returning a value, all these things would still remain the same. So the only thing that is changing is the creation of the function, the syntax you use for creating a function. So just wanted to make that clear. Anyways, let's talk about it. So you can see these two functions are basically declared with the function declaration syntax, right? Actually, let's make it return just so it's like you can understand that's basically the same things that we already talked. So yeah. So what I want to do now is to actually convert these into function expressions. So let me just write it down here that it's basically function declaration. And let me also go and disable this codium. It's gonna like just disturb a lot. Anyways, let's talk about function expression. Using function expression, let's try to create it. So what you can do, you can do something like this. You just say print number up to n. So you can see I'm creating a constant. You can create a variable as well. And then I just give that variable or constant a name. Okay. So I just gonna give it the name with expression. Okay. Anyways, let's give equals to sign. Now what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna write this function, but as a value. So what that means is I'm going to do something like this, that function n, and then whatever the code block was, I'm just going to copy that stuff over here, and that's it. I have got a function, but this time I have created a function as a value, basically as a function expression. Okay. So you can see in this case, what is happening is that you created a function, right? You just use the function declaration syntax only, but instead of having this function without any instead of like having this function as an independent function, what you did is that you just stored that function inside a variable or constant. Okay. And you also didn't give it any name. So I've not given it any name, which means it doesn't have any name, right? Now I can call this function. It's basically the same as here. I can call this function. So let's actually call this first of all. So print number up to n, print number up to n. I say 40 over here, and we just print up to 40, right? Let's make it 10 so that's more visible. Yeah. And then after that, let's try the same over here. So I'm just going to say with expression, and you can see it works in the same. So this function exists inside this constant. Now this function doesn't have any name. So the problem comes how I would actually call this function. The way is very simple. You use the variable or constant name that stores that function. And so if you call that variable or constant name just like I did over here, that would internally call this function itself. And so the function would just perform whatever it has to perform and it would give the output. Okay. So yeah, that's how you can see we can use these function expressions. Let's just do this one as well. So again, it's very easy. It's not something very hard to do. You just again say introduce me. So basically you name the function, actually the constant or variable that is storing that function. And so you say introduce me with function expression. And then you actually write the function. So I can just go and write this and I just remove the name from here. Okay. Once I do that, this is again another thing that I have, like the same function thing. So I can just call this here, introduce me, and I just pass the name and the age, and this is basically gonna give me back. It's gonna return me back the introduction. Okay, you can see it returns me back the introduction. Same I can do over here. Just I need to replace the name with introduce me with expression, and I just go and console log that over here, and you can see it returns the same result. So you can see it's the same thing. Anyways, I hope that makes sense. That's how you can like create function expressions, and that's the basically the difference that is there in the syntax. At least I'm not talking about the actual difference. The difference is just there right now in syntax as I show you. One more thing which I would like to show you here is that you can create a function expression with a name. Okay, so right now we just created like two function expressions over here and both didn't have any kind of name, but it's not necessary to not have a name to a function expression. You can actually give a name to a function expression as well. So let me show you that. So if I go and say sum and then I say function a comma b. Okay, so you can see I created a function called sum. Okay, and I can just return the sum from here, return a plus b, and then I basically go and console log a or actually let's just print that. Let's not return it. I'll tell you why I'm not returning it in a bit. But anyways, you can see I call this function 2 3 and that returns and that prints 5. Okay, it's working fine. Now what I said is that you can create a function expression with function name. In this case the function expression didn't have any name, but I can add that name over here. So maybe I can add like uh, function expression sum. You can see that I did that, and that function expression got a name. Okay. Now I'm calling this with sum, which is working fine. But now the question comes, what would happen if I call the function with this name? So you might assume that's going to work because you have given this name to this function. But in reality, when you call this like that, you will see that you get an error that this is not defined. Okay, this is not defined. Now, you might ask why this is happening. This is happening because this name that you give to this function expression is not visible outside this function. What that means is that you can call this function inside in like you can use this name inside the function code block itself. You can't use this function name outside the code block, and that's the thing you need to understand over here. Okay, so if you see, I can just print this, and you can see it works over here. I can print the value of this function. By the way, you can see a lambda sign over here. What is this lambda sign? This is nothing but just like notation for function in Core JS. Basically, the functions are printed like that when you are printing it in Core JS. Okay, it's not something else. Okay, but yeah, that's something. And then you can just if you call sum here, that also gives you the function name properly. You can also use sum basically inside the function itself. But if you try to print the value of function expression outside this, you can see it's not defined. Okay, again, so it's basically the same error, because as I said, it's only visible inside the function block. Okay, so that's the thing about creating a function expression with function name. Anyways, not very practical thing to do, but yeah. Because anyways, if you actually want to use the function inside the function code block itself, you can just use this, right? You can just use the constant or variable name that stores that function. That would also work. So this usually is I don't find any kind of use case. I just told you about this just so that's very clear to you. Anyways, uh, let's talk about the next thing, and that is difference between function declaration and function expression. Again, a very important thing to understand, because see, these two things are not just there for no reason, right? There is a difference between function declaration and function expression, and I would give you a conclusion on what you should actually use. I would give that at the end of this session, at the end of this basically topic. But yeah, let's talk about it. So let's first of all talk about the first difference, and that is function declaration is hoisted. Now, what that means? What is hoisting? So hoisting is a property that is shown by, for example, var. So let me show you one thing over here, which is very interesting. If I go and say let a equal to 2, I print the value of a, that works fine, and I get the value of 2. But if I try to do the same above the declaration over here, you would see that I get the value, I don't get the value, and I cannot access a before initialization. That's the error I get. Now you might ask why this is happening. I'm going to talk about this in detail when we talk about lat versus var. This would be the next topic for us. We're going to talk about that in that video. For now, you just understand that this is not going to work. But there is a thing that you don't know, and that is about var. If I go and say var over here, there's no change in this. But if you try to print the value of a above this var declaration, this time it would not give any kind of error. It would just give you a value of undefined. Now, you can see this happening properly, that like before the variable declaration line is reached, the variable has a value of undefined. Once that line is reached, after that, the value of a is defined, and that is 2. But you can see, because you use var, you can access that variable before even it's declared. Okay, because internally JavaScript would automatically declare it, and that's called hoisting. In a way, JavaScript would move this var variable at the top of the script, which means even when you have created this afterwards, the variable itself would be declared before before anything executes, which means you will be able to access the value. You will be able to access the value here, although the value won't be exactly what you gave, but it's still accessible, and that's the point over here. Okay, so yeah, uh so you can see this is called basically hoisting. That's called hoisting. That variable is basically accessible. You won't get any kind of error, but you will just get undefined in that case. Anyways, this is called hoisting. And the thing about function is that function declaration is hoisted. What that means is that you can do something like this, that you just went ahead and say function a, and you say console log a. So basically, you can call a after the function a has been declared. Uh, okay, there's some kind of issue over here. Oh shit. Okay, so they are like var a and function a. Basically, they are conflicting. Let me make it b. Anyways, let's make it B and let's call B over here. Now, when I call B, it would basically print the value properly, okay? Because I'm calling it after the declaration. But the interesting thing over here is that even if you call it before the declaration, it would work fine. So you can see, even before the declaration, it worked fine. And that's the thing. Function declarations are hoisted. You can access the function before it's declared. That's the thing about function declarations. Okay. But the same doesn't hold true when you are talking about function expressions. Okay. So if you do something like this with function expression, let's say I created const c equal to a function, and let's actually make it like this. And then I just go and say console log c. Now when I call this function, it works fine. I access the function after it's declared. If I try to do that before it's declared, you can see cannot access C before initialization. So basically it's behaving in the same way as it behaved earlier, right? As it behaved in this case, basically, right? So this is happening because let and const are not hoisted. And that's why when you're creating a function with const or you create with let as well, it's not going to get hoisted, and you would see that you are not able to access the function before it's declared. Okay, let me go and get it inside this this thing, and let's get this below. Okay, I hope that's clear. But as I said, var variables are declared. And see, the idea of function expression is that you store that function expression inside a variable or constant as a value. So I shown you that you can create a function and store that inside a constant, and also you can do it inside a let as well. I can show you that. You can see you can store the function inside let as well. In the same way, you can store a function inside var as well. So I can do something like this, var d equal to function, and then I just went ahead and said console log d. And now I call this function, it's going to work fine. I'm calling it after the variable declaration has reached. But if I try to call this before that, now the thing comes is that if you try to call it, if you can see it's saying D is not a function, right? So this is kind of strange. Like this might sound strange considering that functions are hoisted and var is also hoisted, but it's very actually it's actually very logical if you think about it. Like if you think about it, when the B was hoisted, you were able to call it because B was still there. When a variable with var was hoisted, you can see that the variable got a value of undefined. Although it was accessible, but that doesn't mean you can call it, right? I mean, you can't access the value inside it because the variable would get a value once that initialization line reaches, once that 62 line reaches. Before that, the variable would be undefined. So the same happens over here. In this case also, D at this point would be undefined. It would exist. You can basically print the value of it, but it would be undefined. It would only get defined when you reach this point over here. Okay. So although the hoisting happened, but it didn't happen in the same way as it happens in the case of functions. In case of functions, the functions get hoisted and you can even call these hoisted functions. But when you do the hoisting with var for a function expression, you can't call that function expression, but you can access the value inside that function expression. That's the idea. I mean, not the actual value you can access, but you can just like, reference that function variable. You can do that, but you can't call that. I hope that's clear. Anyways, that's about hoisting part. So you can see function declaration is hoisted, but function expressions are not hoisted, except when it comes to var. But that also with like limitation, like you can't call it before it reaches the declaration line. Sorry, the function creation line. Okay, anyways, let's talk about the next difference. The next difference is function declaration are not block scoped. Now, what I mean by that, it's very simple to understand it. You already know that what is block scope. Basically, if I create a variable inside a block or constant inside a block, that constant or variable is only accessible inside that block I can't access it outside the block. That we already know, right? Now, function declarations are not block scoped. Okay. What that means is that if you actually go and create a function inside a block, actually, it's printing the value of A. Now, why it's printing the value of A, it's very interesting because A was already there. So don't get confused in that. Let me actually go and make it D, just so that's very clear, right? Oh, D is also defined as a function. Okay, anyways, let's make it E. I hope E is not defined. Yeah, so you can see E is not defined and we didn't get the value of E outside the block. But E is accessible inside the block. Let's call this over here. Actually, let's make it F so that doesn't conflict when we call it outside this. So if I call this function over here, you can see that I'm able to call this function properly inside the block. Now, you might assume that as it's created inside the block, it won't be accessible outside the block. But in case of function declaration, that's not true. That's actually partially true. There's a case in which they won't be accessible outside the block. But in this case, if we actually try to call f, you can see you are able to call f even when the function was declared inside the block. This is happening because function declarations are not block scoped. But there's a condition over here. The condition is that only in sloppy mode. Now, what is sloppy mode in JavaScript? And uh, like, what is sloppy mode here? Sloppy mode, I'm going to talk about that later on. There's something called strict mode. Again, we're going to discuss about sloppy and strict mode together later on. But for now, you should understand that when you are inside a strict mode, you won't be able to access this function f outside this block. Let me show you. So if I try to go and make like turn on the strict mode. Now, how you turn on the strict mode? You can just like add a line at the top that says use strict. Okay. When you enable that line, you can see that I'm not able to access this function f. Okay. This is happening because now you are in a strict mode. Okay. I hope that makes sense. But if I comment this, you can see it's again accessible now. Okay. So I'm just going to write at the top that you should only uncomment it when you want to actually look at this scenario. Okay. Now, the next thing over here is that function expressions are not are always block scoped. The reason is very simple because const and let are block scoped, and so function expressions are always block scoped. By the way, this won't happen in case of var. I'm going to talk about the difference between var, const, and let later on. There you would understand that way better. But for now, you can just like create a function with const or let, and just say console log g inside it. And now if I actually try to print the value of g, like call g inside the block, you can see I'm able to access that. But if I try to do it outside the block, it's not accessible outside the block. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. But again, as I said, if you try to create a function with var, that would be accessible outside the block as well, because var is not block scoped. Again, these all things you will understand when you actually talk about var versus const versus let. We're going to talk about that in the next video. But anyways, let's just say this h, and I go and say h, I call this function. When I call this function, it's accessible inside the block, but when I try to access it outside the block, it's also accessible outside the block. So I hope that makes sense. Anyways, so that's the difference between function declarations and function expression. I hope you understood these things. Now, honestly, for me, it doesn't matter. Like, I really don't matter about these things too much. Like, it doesn't cause any kind of issues for me. So I don't really care about it. So I can use anything I want. I can use function declaration. I can use a function expression as well. Whatever I want to use, I can use that. The thing is, then it only comes to your personal preference. Although you know about these things, if these things matter to you, you should always use function expression in this case. But if it doesn't matter, then you can just use any of them. It would then like depend on your preference. I prefer to use function expression, and that too arrow function, which is basically a kind of function expression. We're going to talk about that. But that's my personal preference, and that's what you can also use, but it just depends on you. Okay. Anyways, let's take this back to this file and let's talk about the next thing here, which is callback function, which would be clear because now we understand about function expressions, right? So let's talk about it. So callback function is basically a function that is passed as a value to another function. Now, see, when we talk about functions, function can accept any kind of value. So the thing is that when they can accept any value, that value can be anything. That value can be a big int, that value can be a number, that value can be a string, that value can be anything. Anything that you want, you can give to the function. And also you can get back anything from the function. It doesn't matter, you can return any kind of thing from a function. Now, when that is possible, and you already know that with the help of function expression, you can create function as a value. So because of that, you can actually go and pass functions as a value, as an argument to another function. Let me show you. So let's say I just say function A, and this function accepts a function called B, and then it just calls that function. Now what I can do here, I can just go and create, let's say a function called C. And now what I can do, I can call A and pass C to it. And you can see when I do that, I get I get this printed. So you can see I didn't call this C. I just passed it C to this A function. And then A internally called C with the name of B because it was accepting the function as B. Okay. Now, one thing you can see, I was even able to pass a function declaration around as a value. So it's just not about function expression. You can even pass function declarations as a value to a function. Okay. Or you can just do one thing. You can just create a function D as a function expression. And you go print D over here. Okay. And then you call A passing D to it. So you can see when you do that, it again prints the value of D. Okay, like it basically calls that D, and this time I was passing a function expression. Earlier I was passing a function declaration. Okay, now this is not the only thing you can do. You can even literally write a function directly like for example, if you want to pass a value, and for example you want to pass 2, you directly go and say like 2 over here, and then that is passed to the function, right? In the same way, you can directly write the function here. Okay, you can directly write the function expression over here. So I can do something like this: function e, and then you just go and say console log e. So you can clearly see over here, I pass the function directly as a value in the arguments, just like I did while passing normal parameters, normal arguments, right? Like I just said to SHA-20 directly, right? I didn't store these into a constant or variable and then passed that variable constant over here. I didn't do that. I directly passed that over here, okay? So that's the thing about it. So yeah, that's the thing about this. And by the way, that's what callback function is. So the C over here is a callback function, right? The callback, you're passing that function to another function, and then that function is calling that function, is calling back that function, right? And that's why it's called callback function. Like that, this is also callback function, right? This is also a callback function, okay? So yeah, that's the thing about callback functions. Now, although we understand about callback functions properly now, but these examples are not really practical. Let's actually talk about some practical examples for callback functions. So let's say that we have a function called pay now, okay? Or let's say pay for order, okay? Now this function basically accepts something called account ID, and then that account ID it accepts. So you can say function here, and then you just say this. Okay. So you basically say that trying to charge, and then you give account number for payment of order. Okay. So you just log that to tell that you're trying to charge the account number. Let's say account number. So you basically go and say that. And yeah, again, I'm just going to write pseudocode, like almost pseudocode, because obviously we are not going to implement payment integration over here, right? But anyways, let's talk about it. So you do this, and then after that, what you do is that you just write some code which actually processes the payment. Um, Now, what's that code? We don't know. We just say that, okay, this is a code that processes the payments. Okay. Once payment is done, you actually come to a conclusion that if payment is done or not. So you basically, for now, I'm just gonna create a constant that is constant actually, like it's gonna just gonna have a value of true for is payment success. Okay. Now, what you want to do is that to um, you want to basically have pay for order call a function if the payment is successful, and if payment fails, you want it to call some other function. In that case, you can provide it two callback function parameters. One could be on success, on payment success, right? And another could be on payment fail. So if the payment succeeds, it's gonna call this one. If it failed, it's gonna call this one. So I can just go and write a conditional statement. If is payment success, I just call on payment success. Otherwise, I call on payment fail. Okay. So you can see that's how I'm doing it. And so what I can do here, I can just go and say pay for order. And then I go and say account number. Then account number can be like this. And then I just go and say on payment success. So I'm just going to pass a function over here. And I'm going to pass another function for on payment fail. So what you can do inside this function, you can do anything. You can maybe like add a record of purchase, right? And add a transaction and change the transaction status to success, right? And here in the on payment fail, you can maybe like change this transaction status to fail, right? So you can see, you can do something like this in these callback functions. And now you can just go and say console log, let's say success. I'm just like right now, just writing some hard coded console logs for now. But obviously, you can just replace this with actual code for doing this stuff. Okay. But yeah, that's how you can see. Like I just did this, and you can see I get success uh, printed because this function is being called. Okay. And if I make this false, you can see then the fail function is being called. Now, you might ask, what's the actual benefit? Can't I just go and here and just like directly go and write the code for payment success and payment fail? I can do that, but see, the problem is that in that case, that function that you're writing over here might not be as general as you want it to be. See, there's one thing that you need to understand when you're writing the functions. I would always recommend to make it general, okay? Which means it can be used in different places, okay? In a way that it adapts to that situation. So like in this case, you can see for this example, I maybe wanted to add a record of purchase and change transaction status to success. And in this case, I want to change the transaction status to fail. But what if I actually want to uh, go here and like in this case, I want to add the card, uh, add the card to the database, okay? And here I just wanted to uh, mark card as invalid, or in this case actually account. So you can see over here these two these two calls to the pay for order does the same thing, that it wants to cut the payment, but the end result of payment success or payment fail has a different use case. In this case, I was actually adding a record for purchase, and change the transaction status to success, or in failed case, I want to change the transaction status to failed. But in this case, I wanted to actually add the account to the database because I was just validating that account, right? Like maybe it's the first, uh, actually let's name it as pay. So that's more general because in this case, you're not paying for order. Let's just rename this and let's talk about that in from there. So yeah, basically in this case, you're calling the pay function to have the payment done. But in this case, you are actually if the payment succeeds, you want to add the account to the database. Otherwise, you would mark the account as invalid, which means you can't use that account anymore for payments. So you can see these two are different use cases, but they share the same logic of processing the payment, because the processing the payment logic would not change over here. And that's where the functions would help, the callback functions would help. The callback function logic might change, doesn't matter to this function. You can pass any kind of logic in these callback functions. It is not going to matter to this function at all. It's just going to do the payment and call the functions accordingly. And that's the use case of callback functions. You can modify the callback functions to your particular use case without modifying the actual function that is doing the stuff. That's the main use case for the callback functions. Anyways, I hope that makes sense. Let me go and copy it over here. And let's talk about the next thing, which is the arrow functions. So arrow functions is basically like a syntax, is an alternative syntax to write the function expressions. So as you know, we can do something like this, right? You can do something like um, this over here. Let's call it A. You say A over here. And when you call A, you get the value printed. Okay. So this is called function expression, but you can write this in an alternative syntax, which is arrow function syntax. In the arrow function syntax, what you have to do is that you say D, and then what you do is that you just go and say this. You don't write function here, okay? And then what you do is that you just give equals to, and you give arrow, the like not arrow actually, it's like the right angle bracket, and then you give the function block. And here you can do anything. So you can just say console log B. I'm just gonna name it as B. And when I call B, I just get this. You can see that's how easy it is. You can just declare the function like that as an arrow function. Okay. Now you can see it's more concise as because like function keyword is not there. But that's just not the only thing that arrow function has. Arrow function has even better syntax when there is just one line. So in this case, it was just one line. In that case, there's a better syntax. Let me show you. So you can do something like this here, const C, this. Now after this, you don't need to give any kind of curly braces if there's just one line of code. The same you have seen in iterative statement, conditional statement. When there was just one line of code, you didn't give any kind of curly braces. But that is not possible in this case. You can't do something like this in this case, right? You have to give curly braces always. But when you talk about arrow functions, you can actually remove these curly braces and directly do something like this. And when you try to call C, it would basically print D. Okay. Now it's not showing that, but it's basically printing it. If you see in the console log, you can see it's basically printing that. Let's actually make it print C. And you can see it's printing that thing, right? So it's not like it's not printing it, it's printing it actually, but you're not able to see it in Core.js. But anyways, that might be some kind of bug. Anyways, what I mean is that you can do something like this over here with arrow functions. That is not possible with function expression. So you can see the flexibility it gives to you. And that's not the end of it. It also has more flexibility. So if you take an example over here, let's say I don't know. Actually, let's not take that example. Let's take that example later on. Let's first of all take some other example because I feel that would be better. But anyways, what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to say D, and let's say I take a like a function parameter. So I can just go and say like I want to take n here, and then I basically go and print the value of n. That's easy. Like it should make a lot of sense. I can also do something like this and print the value. That's all fine. So you can see I just say D4 and that prints the value of 4. If you see in the console logs, you can see 4, it's being printed. Now, the thing is that as you're just having one parameter, as you're just having one function parameter, you can do something else too, which is even more flexible over here. And that's something like this. So if you print this, actually you should go and say E, and you can see that prints, actually you should pass 5 here, for example. You can see it prints 5, right? So I hope you understood that when there's one parameter, you can even remove this parenthesis and just directly write the parameter over there. This is not going to work when you have multiple parameters. Like if like you have f equal to n and g and you print n and g over here. Now you can see I'm giving parenthesis for the parameters list. So if I go and say f 4 5, it's going to work fine. I'm just going to get 4 5 over here. But if I do the same like this, n comma g equal to console log n comma g, you can see I'm getting some kind of error that is happening because you can't do something like this. And I'm not getting any kind of log. I'm just getting like the error that you can't do this. Okay. So yeah, this is not possible. This is just possible when there's like one function parameter, then only you can skip this. Although I don't prefer to skip these parentheses, the reason is this is very confusing, honestly. This is less confusing, but this is most confusing. And this is the most clear thing. Verbose, very verbose. But this is way less verbose. So it just depends on you, right? You can write something like this, but it just depends. I personally don't prefer this because of the confusion that might occur. Okay. Anyways, that's how you can see you can use arrow function. You can see the flexibility they provide. I'm just gonna take the two examples that we usually use. Print number up to n. Let's take that example, and I'm also gonna take example of the another one, which is the, let me see, parameters and argument. Yeah, introduce me. So I'm just gonna take these two examples here. Let's go and say n over here. This would actually explain you everything. So let's convert this into function, arrow function. Okay. So I'm just gonna keep this inside this comment and let's write an arrow function for this. I can just say print number up to n, and then I just go and say that n equal to, and I just say for let I equal to 1, I less than equal to n, and then I plus plus, let's see, loop, and I just go and say console log I. Okay. So you can see I've used arrow function for this. I can just go and say call the print number up to n, and then I just go and give the value of n, and it just prints up to 4. Okay. Now I can just go and also do something like this because there's just one parameter. I can do something like let's say print number up to n alternative. Okay, and I just go and remove the parentheses and directly call this. So print number up to n, and I just pass 5 here, and you can see it would print up to 5. Actually, let me write it over here. Yeah, so you can see it prints up to 5. So yeah, these are two things. These are two ways I can make this function declaration an arrow function, and you can do the similar with this introduce me. Although in this case you won't be able to do something like this because there's two parameters here. So I'm just gonna go and say introduce me, and I'm just gonna copy this thing over here and just this thing over here. And I'm just gonna call this function introduce me, and I'm just gonna pass to Shan and 20. You can see it's working fine. So yeah, that's how you can actually go and use the arrow functions. You can like that's how you can make the arrow functions over here. Now, what's the difference between arrow function and function expression or function declaration? The difference is there, but we are not going to discuss about that right now. We're going to discuss that about later on. Okay. So yeah, but for now you can understand that you can, this is how like you can just use arrow functions instead of function expression. I actually prefer arrow functions more than any other function syntax. Okay, that's again just a personal preference. You can still use function expression or function declarations if you actually want to. And by the way, when I save this code here, you can see those parameters are basically like the parentheses are removed. Okay, so it's just printer that always removes these like adds these parentheses. Okay, and the reason is just for formatting it properly. So yeah, I'm just gonna save it without formatting so that it still is there. Let's talk about the next and last thing, anonymous functions. So till now, we talked about function expression and arrow function, callback function. There we actually saw a lot of examples about anonymous function. Anonymous function is basically a function without any kind of name. So in this case, if I go and say function declaration, actually let's say function declaration A, and I console log A. So in this case, this function is basically a function that is not an anonymous function. The reason is because you gave it a name. Okay, you gave it a name, so it's not an anonymous function. Okay, but if you say const b equal to function, sorry, I should remove this. So you can see this is anonymous function. Why this is anonymous function? Now this might be confusing for you, but it's very easy to understand. See, although you can call this function by name b, but that doesn't mean that the name of this function itself is b. The name of this function is still not b. Okay, so what's the actual name of this function? The actual name of this function is nothing. There's no name given to this function, and that's why this function is also an anonymous function. You are able to call this function only because you stored the value of this function. You store this function as a value inside the constant b, and so when you're calling b, you're basically calling the function itself, and so that's why this was working. But otherwise, this is still an anonymous function. I hope that makes sense. Then the next example is let's say const c. Now in this case, let's say if you do something like this, now is now this is one more example, one more good example over here. Now you might ask, um is this an anonymous function or not? The answer is it's not an anonymous function. The reason is because you gave this function a name, right? Although you can't access that function with that name outside the function, but still you gave it a name. So this is not an anonymous function, and basically you get two names for this function, c and d, one of which basically c you can uh, and you can use one of the name c outside the function, but and inside the function as well, but d can also only be used inside the function. But still, this is not an anonymous function. Anyways, the next thing is arrow function. So if you say e, actually let's say d, if you say something like this, then this function is an anonymous function. Okay, it's basically anonymous plus function expression plus arrow function. Okay, so yeah, so it's basically like an anonymous function here. Then let's say if you have something like this, actually you should call f. So in this case, if you go and say e and then you directly create a function over here. Now I shown you that here that you can actually go and directly pass the function directly like this, right? So you can do this directly here, but I'm just going to use an arrow syntax for this just to make it more clear. But yeah, it's going to use arrow syntax over here. But it just depends. Whatever you want to do, you can do it over here. Okay. So you can see I just printed f over here, and this is again an anonymous function. Okay. And then if we just go and say, let's say function g, and I say console log g. So you can see in this case, it's not an anonymous function because you gave it a name. Okay. And so it's not an anonymous function. I hope that's clear. Now, one more thing about anonymous function is that with anonymous function, you can actually do something called IIF. Now, what is IIFE? IIFE means immediately invoking function expressions. So basically, if you see, like, if I go and create, let's say h, and this is a function that, does this, and I say h over here. Now, when I do this, h is created, but this doesn't get called anytime here. So I don't see this console log being printed. So this function doesn't execute on its own. But let's say if you want the function to execute on its own, now what's the use case for immediately, like, automatically executing functions? I'm going to talk about that later on in some later part of the, some later part of the series. But for now, uh, if you want to do that kind of stuff, you can use immediately invoking functions. Now, if you directly do something like this, you can see you are getting some error. Like, you can definitely go and pass this to E, for example. So I can do this, but this on its own won't work. Okay, so, like, you might ask why that is happening. Like, both of these things are similar, right? The thing is that you're creating this but not using it as a value, and that's the problem. This is a function value only, but you're not using it. In this case, you were using that function value, and that's why it worked fine. In this case, it would cause issue because of that reason, that you're not using it as a value. So yeah, that's the thing about it. And basically, this also happens with anonymous functions as well. So, like, the arrow function as well. So you can't do something like this. It's gonna cause issues. Okay. But yeah, this doesn't happen with function declaration, as you've seen. Like, you can directly say function G, whatever, like function A, for example. This is possible, but these two things are directly not possible. So what you can do instead is, like, so basically that means one thing, that this would not work at all. Okay. But what you can do here, you can just go and do something like this, which basically means that you're wrapping this around parenthesis, which makes this as an expression, and then you're calling that expression. Because that expression is a function, you can call it, and that would just print the value inside it. So I can say I am IIFE. So you can see this is called immediately invoking function expression. It immediately got invoked. Okay. So yeah, that's the thing about IIFE. You can see you can do something like this with the help of anonymous functions. And yeah, that's all about functions here in JavaScript. This is just the basics, by the way. I'm going to cover functions in depth later on. For now, that's all the basics you need to understand before continuing with the next lectures. And so yeah, that's about this video. If you have any doubts, you can ask that in comment section below. I would see you in the next one. Bye.